Hi, everybody. My name is Dana Howard, and I'm a member of the Center for Bioethics in the Philosophy Department at The Ohio State University. Welcome to a very special monthly CARE panel, sponsored both by the Center for Ethics and Human Values and also university libraries. The CARE program aims to support Ohio State's Shared Values Initiative in the domain of research by building community around discussions related to research integrity. And I'm so happy that are all joining us today. The program is presented with support from OSUMC's Center for Bioethics and the Clinical and Translational Science Institute. So welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about the ethics of using public social media data for research purposes. And for this CARE panel, we're going to explore who owns social media data, who should have access to it for research purposes, and who should get to decide. This event is sort of the first of many exciting events for this week related to OSU and university libraries' Love Data Week, which is an international celebration of research data. And the theme appropriately for this year is whose data is it anyway? So one thing that I would really recommend is for you all as audience members to join other, both online and in-person events and resources and workshops that are going on. And if you go to university libraries website, you'll find more information about other activities going on this week. All right, so today for the panel, we're lucky to be joined with the following panelists. Casey Fiesler is Associate Professor and founding faculty member of the Information Science Department at University of Colorado-Boulder. Professor Fiesler is she researches and teaches in the area of technology, ethics, internet law and policy, and online communities. Her work on research ethics for data science, ethics education in computing, and broadening participation in computing has been supported by NSF, and she's a recipient of an NSF Career Award. Moreover, she's also an awesome public scholar, and her research has been covered anywhere from the New York Times to Teen Vogue. We are also have with us Dr. Erin Moore, who is the Dr. Carl Asseff Assistant Professor of Anthropology and the History of Medicine at Ohio State University. Dr. Moore is a sociocultural and medical anthropologist, and her research brings critical humanist perspectives to the study of global health, disease, and development, both in sub-Saharan Africa and also in the United States. And we're so excited to have you. And we are also going to be hearing from Dr. Annie Specht, who's an associate professor of agricultural communication at Ohio State University. And her research interests include media portrayals of agriculture, visual communication, ag literacy, and public perceptions of food, which I think is really interesting right now. It's like really on my Instagram. Anyway, so I'm really excited to have this really wide variety of expertise on our panel. The overall structure, we're going to start with Casey to sort of frame the discussion, some of the ethical issues, the work that you have been thinking about. And then we're going to have Erin and then Annie sort of bring up the challenges and also the opportunities that come with engaging in this kind of research. I came up with some questions, but as always, audience members should feel free to ask your own questions. If you look at the bottom, there should be a Q&A function. Feel free to ask any questions throughout the session, and we're going to have plenty of time to discuss those as well. All right. Thank you, everyone. And Casey, why don't you get us started?
Just one second. There we go. Thank you for having me. What a lovely event for the entire week. I'm going to start things off by speaking specifically to some of the research ethics issues around public data, which is something that I have been studying for almost a decade now. I would say it's interesting because we've been hearing, I think, a lot more about the issue of our data that is publicly available in places like social media and how this might be used in lots of contexts, most recently, generative AI. This isn't actually a new issue, though. Scientists, researchers have been using public data in research projects for many, many, many years. Occasionally, these things pop up because of ethical controversies. One that a lot of people heard about was a study out of Stanford where they created a machine learning model to determine whether someone was gay or straight from a photograph. And the data that they used for that training came from dating sites. Another one that you may have heard of, this happened, though, I believe in 2016, was that a researcher in Europe spoofed a logged in user and scraped all of OkCupid, and then released a public data set. And one of the things that I thought was quite striking about this was that the researcher was called out for this on Twitter. And their reaction at the time was, oh, well, this was okay because the data is already public. And the data is already public is such a common ethical heuristic that my collaborator, Michael Zimmer, used this exact phrase in 2010 in a paper about research ethics for Facebook. He also has a Google alert for this phrase, should anyone use it as time goes forward. And of course, we see so much research on so many different platforms that uses public data. And a lot of really important research, too. A lot of what we know, for example, about public health or misinformation on social media comes from doing research studies on platforms like Twitter. Um, RIP Twitter, but we'll still talk about Twitter for a minute. Um, Interestingly, in 2014, Zeynep Tufekci wrote about some of the pitfalls of social media big data, and she talked about Twitter as the fruit fly of academic research. People don't study the fruit fly because it is the best thing to study. But it's not like fruit flies are the most like humans or anything like that. Um, it is easy to study for various reasons: short lifespan, easy to keep alive in a lab. Twitter, similarly, was not the most representative of the population or the content there, but it was very, very easy to get Twitter data because of their open API, again, until quite recently. So for example, in 2018, there was a research study published in which they found that 72% of papers that use Twitter data in PubMed, so medical, health-related papers, quoted at least one tweet verbatim, which led back to the Twitter user 84% of the time. And this again is health related research. So I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But this is very common, not just for Twitter data to be used, sort of big data analyses in the aggregate, but also for content to be quoted in scientific papers. So a number of years ago, myself and a collaborator, Nick Preferis, decided to ask what we saw at the time as a fairly simple research question, but people were kind of just starting to talk about this at the time that we were doing this work. And the question was, how do Twitter users feel about this? Um, we decided to do a survey. And as some of you might be thinking, oh, well, wouldn't there be like a huge amount of selection bias in this survey? People are people who don't like research are going to participate in your research study about how they feel about research? And that was exactly what we thought could happen as well. And we said, well, if we get the findings back and everyone's just like, yeah, research is awesome, who cares? We probably just won't publish it. We used Mechanical Turk for this survey, by the way, so we were able to tell people, and that was not our finding. But because of this, I actually suspect that the results might actually underrepresent how people feel. So what we found was that 61% of people among our participants, who again are participating in a survey, had no idea that this is a thing that happens. And of those, almost half of them thought, well, that can't be allowed. Now, we weren't actually interested in the study of thinking about like whether this practice as a whole is okay or not. I mean, I had just started as a new faculty member. I was not about to tell everyone in the research world that they shouldn't use Twitter data. Like that might not have resulted in me getting tenure. But what we were interested in was what kinds of things matter, the contextual factors that matter. No, I don't expect you to make any meaning out of this table. You can look it up in the paper. But the point here is that a lot of things change how comfortable people feel about this, right? And I was talking to my students about this last week, and I said, "Hey, how would you feel if, a scientist like quoted one of your social media posts?" And of course, someone raised their hand and said, "Well, which social media posts?" And I said, "Exactly. Which social media post is one thing that should matter?" Um, and in the whole, some of the things that we should be thinking about here are, what is the data? A tweet about what you had for breakfast is not the same as a tweet revealing a sensitive medical condition. And the idea that these things should be treated equivalently is absurd. Also, what you're going to do with it. What's your goal as a researcher? Are you doing something good for the world or not? That's also something people care about, who you are, and also what the expectations and norms of the users are in this particular space. Um, so following the study, for a number of years after that, a series of my graduate student advisees did studies that looked at particular types of populations with these questions around research ethics, for example, Black Twitter and people with chronic illnesses. So I'm going to go briefly through some of these, because one of the things that I think is really important here is this idea that we are looking at particular communities a lot of times. So, one participant in one of these research studies said, these people come in here, they just parachute in. They don't really look around. They just leave. They take the data and they leave, and they don't necessarily understand what's going on. And in looking at particular communities that might be marginalized or vulnerable, we see a lot of these kinds of things again that really matter, like who you are. So for example, when Shamika Klassen was interviewing participants on Black Twitter about this, something that came up was that it really makes a big difference whether the researchers are Black or not, which might seem kind of obvious, but interestingly, when it comes to research ethics, when we talk about positionality, we also often talk about, qualitative research, like, oh, how's your rapport with your subjects when you're doing interviews? How often do we reflect on positionality when we're doing big data work? And, there was actually a particular controversy in the Black Twitter community where some researchers scraped the Black and the Ivory hashtag, for example. And one of the things that came up then was the identity of the researchers. At least if you're doing human subjects research, you're at least talking to people who are part of that community. But how often are we analyzing and interpreting data from a community without talking to people and without having anyone in the research team who's a part of that community? It also matters what your goals are. So for example, when one of my PhD advisees was talking to fat people about their experiences online, one of the things that came up was research ethics. And someone said, well, it matters what they're doing. Like, a lot of people just want to paint us in a bad light. Or they're just doing this to advance their career, and they don't particularly care about the people whose data they're looking at. So these kinds of things matter as well. Another student talked to people who post content online about chronic illness, and someone talked about feeling like a lab rat. Like, your data is just being used, and they're poking at you. You never find out what happened. They're just like, hey, thanks for the data, even that like how often also when we're doing big data studies are we sharing our findings back to the community versus not? Um, these kinds of feelings have come up again in the context of generative AI. We've seen headlines like this one, not for machines to harvest. One of the populations that's talked about in this news article actually is fan fiction writers, which was a group that I studied as part of my dissertation work. And I was looking very much at copyright norms in this community. And one of the things that matters a lot for that particular community is attribution and credit for work. And so it was a huge norm violation for their fan fiction to be taken to train these systems without anyone getting any kind of credit or attribution. But when it comes to research ethics, that's also something that can be a little bit tricky because things like attribution are sometimes at tension with privacy. Um, Again, we hear about this a lot in terms of generative AI recently. So for example, Reddit has a deal with OpenAI to use Reddit content for training. I don't know if any of you ever, read Reddit stories. There's all these podcasts. Well, they'll read them to you if you haven't heard them, but people post very personal stories on Reddit quite often. And there's been some backlash against this as well. Interestingly, with Twitter as a easy fruit fly research site kind of out of the picture since Twitter became X and they greatly limited the research API, et cetera, Reddit has become an extremely popular place for research. I mean, it has been for a long time, but I think even more so now. Of course, in the time since I did the work that I'm about to describe to you, Reddit has also greatly limited access to research data, so take that with a grain of salt. But my collaborators and I were looking for good examples of people being reflective about research ethics with public data. And so we read, first thing we did was read 700 papers that use Reddit data. Less than 150 of them mentioned ethics at all. And when I say mention, I mean if they said, the data is public, so that's okay. We even counted that. But what we looked through were the kinds of things that people were talking about. And these provide a kind of list for like the kinds of things that you might be thinking about when using public data. So one is, and I'm speaking to folks probably potentially across the world, but at least housed at a US university here. So when I talk about IRBs, as some of you may know, use of public data in research typically does not fall under IRB purview because it does not constitute human subjects research under the specifications of the common rule in US law. But a lot of people talked about, even though I still ask my IRB for advice, or here's the things that I did instead. Also taking particular care for sensitive topics, which there are a lot of on Reddit. And some of the most commonly studied subreddits actually are around things like mental health. Obfuscating data or using ethical fabrication. If we go back to that paper about Twitter PubMed articles, one of the things was that you could get back to the original tweet quite easily. That might not be the case if you, for example, paraphrased it. Limiting access to data. In some academic communities, there's a norm, even sometimes verging on requirements for sharing data sets. There are times when that may not be appropriate, depending on the sensitivity of the data and these kinds of things. Weighing risks versus benefits, which means not just thinking about the risks, but also what are the benefits. There are a lot of papers in our Reddit data set where the only justification motivation for the work at all was like, we built another machine learning classifier to see if we could. At some point there should be something about benefits, I think, beyond could we, if there are any potential harms. And then research positionality, which I talked about a little bit. A lot of times when we're thinking about research ethics, we're thinking about individual harms. Reddit is also an interesting case of when there can be community harms. And so other things that you might be thinking about are engaging with community gatekeepers and representatives. So on Reddit, for example, that might be moderators. The same would be true for like a Facebook group or something like that. Participating in the community towards understanding their norms or spending a lot of time there rather than just going in and grabbing the data and leaving. Pairing trace data analysis with human subjects research to help with interpretation, including community members as part of the research team. And also, when possible, sharing research back with the community with a big asterisk there, because there are communities that we might study intentionally with trace data because they might be dangerous to engage with, or could put researcher safety at risk. And in those cases, you certainly would not want to be doing this. So that can become a bit tricky as well. And so I will leave you with this final list of things that one might consider when collecting data. What are the norms and the expectations of the people who are represented by that data? How could individuals and/or communities be harmed, either by using it at all or disseminating it beyond its original context? Who benefits from this use? And also, are the people benefiting the same ones who are facing potential harms or not? It's not just about the benefits of research, but also who is it benefiting? And also, what could you do to mitigate the potential for harm or increase the likelihoods for the benefits of this work? And then finally, can you answer those questions well enough to suggest that you're the right person to be conducting that research or doing that work? So hopefully this was a good overview of some of the issues here to get us started. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone else, and I will be back to answer questions too.
Thanks so much, Casey. Erin, do you want to go next to just introduce yourself and your work and how you've been going about this kind of research?
Yeah, sure. And Casey, thanks so much. That was such a great overview and really interesting work. And I'm really excited to be here as I'm somewhat new to social media research and think through the ethical issues a lot myself as an ethnographer. Um, so and in a lot of ways, I was thinking during your presentation, a lot of my approach to using social media data is very small n. Ethnographers are always working with very, very small n's and trying to tell broader like cultural and social stories from those small n's. And so I was just kind of wondering, Casey, too, in terms of thinking about the smallness of the sample and how that kind of impacts the kinds of questions you were talking about. So my current research project is about the insulin affordability crisis. And so I've used social media as both a methodological tool to to understand what is happening, what are people talking about, to find activists, to find organizations, and I've also used it as a cultural artifact. Citing Twitter in my in some writing that I've done, not using the name of the Twitter person, but I know fully right that the as Casey was saying, it can kind of get back to the person. So just to give a bit of context, in the 90s, as the result of kind of a confluence of factors, the price of insulin increased almost 1,200%. So the cost of a person's monthly cost to stay alive with insulin went from about $25 to sometimes more than $600 a month. The people who use insulin and to live are type 1 diabetics. Many type 2 diabetics are insulin dependent, but a type 1 diabetic, and people say this on Twitter a lot, or constantly on Twitter and in other social media venues, invoke a proximity to fatality in order to make the claim, right? So they say, without insulin, I have 48 hours to live. This is a huge crisis. Many people are dying. The people who are particularly vulnerable are around the age of 26 to 35, when they age out of their parents' insurance plans and then get caught up in a kind of bureaucratic mire that leaves them unable to afford their insulin. In the couple of years preceding the pandemic, activists started to organize around this to get state level and federal level legislation passed to redress this issue, and a lot of the organizing was happening online by the hashtags diabetic online community or hashtag DOC. So my my research. So I have followed this movement online. I also just last week was in DC with activists in person who were lobbying and creating kind of public performances around the kind of circus of insulin greed is what they called it. So and that project is still ongoing. I'm still conducting that research. And I wanted to describe in another small project that's a subset of this research, which involved TikTok. And I was thinking too, Casey, during your presentation about the ways that different platforms do different things, right? And users engage with them to do different things, because this paper was very much about how the parents of children with type 1 diabetes use TikTok to visibilize the psychological distress that they undergo managing their children's illnesses, right? So fundamental to this paper was the fact that these TikTok performances were just that. They were performances meant to demonstrate something, meant to demonstrate a phenomenon in the world that deserved to be marked. So with that paper, I worked with 6 students, undergrads and graduate students in my lab. And the way we conducted that research was, oh, and I wanted to mention something else too, which is that when I started to get interested in TikTok, I'm not a native TikTok user, right? I don't use TikTok in my own life. So I had an undergrad train it, and we talked about different kind of hashtags and words and videos to follow, and train my particular TikTok. So that worked kind of well. It still had a lot of her own like interests in the TikTok. She was a nursing student, so it was kind of a mash of TikToks about diabetes or diabetes talk and nursing videos. So in this lab for this TikTok paper, so it started with a general interest in diabetes talk. We discovered this parent-child kind of these parent-child performances by doing kind of a broad survey, right? So fundamental to ethnographic research is that we're inductive. We have some general questions, but we go in, get the data, and then we analyze the data for those patterns and see what the patterns tell us, right? So we go in with general questions. So the general question was, what is happening on diabetes talk? So 6 students looked through TikTok and picked and looked through diabetes talk and kind of had a general perusal, and they chose videos that they thought were of interest, to them. They brought them to a collaborative conversation where we talked about why those videos were interesting and tried to establish some initial patterns. Once we had those initial patterns, we went and got more videos and eventually created a database of 100 or so, or 90 videos that we were then able to kind of look through and mark for patterns. And and one of the largest patterns that we found was this kind of parent-child interaction. So these videos often show parents being very physically involved with their child's diabetes. So injecting a continuous blood glucose monitor, or maybe giving a shot, taking a blood sugar. So we thought about the way that TikTok, the format, is able to kind of allow parents to give voice to the trauma of this experience, right? Of having to cause a child, especially a small child, pain, right? So that this became the kind of center of this project. And yeah, so I think, let's see. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that. And yeah, thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Erin. And Annie, do you want to just introduce yourself and your work?
Sure. So my name is Annie Specht, as Dana noted. I'm an associate professor in the agricultural communication program here at Ohio State. And no, we don't talk to cows in agricultural communication, but we do occasionally talk about cows with various audiences. So having to explain what it is that I do on a daily basis is just something I've gotten used to. So to provide a little bit of context, I've been working with social media data since graduate school. So back in, the mid, 20-aughts, looking at specifically how agricultural communities were utilizing Twitter to have conversations about key issues within the industry. So, a lot of the work that I do is really focused on our food system, our food production system, and how public perception of the practices that we utilize and the way we use resources and the food chain, how all of that is impacted by the way that the public views it, because that has trickle-down effects and trickle-up effects to everything from consumer behavior all the way up to legislative choices and policy choices. So back in the day, doing social media research looked like literally searching for hashtags and copying and pasting tweets into a spreadsheet and doing some, in my case, a lot of qualitative analysis of that data to kind of get a sense of what those conversations looked like. So at the time, I was doing some research on looking at how there was a particular, weekly agriculture conversation called Ag Chat that happened every Wednesday night. And so, as agricultural communications researchers, we were really interested in looking at the conversation and how relationships were being formed, how issues were being addressed, and specifically looking for what were the strategies that the people who were engaging in that conversation were using to, share information about the industry with people outside of kind of our little agriculture bubble. So that was how I kind of got my foot in the door in terms of doing this type of research. When I came to Ohio State as a faculty member, I got some grant funding and we got access to a social media data aggregation platform that we use to look at a number of what we refer to in our college as grand challenges related to food production and food security. And one of the big ones that came out, I started in 2014 at Ohio State, and that summer there was a really big algae bloom in Lake Erie that was tied to agricultural runoff. The city of Toledo didn't have potable drinking water for several days. And it was a really, really big wake-up call for folks in the agriculture industry about how some of the practices that were happening up in Northwest Ohio from a production standpoint were impacting the communities around Lake Erie and their ability to access clean drinking water, among other things. So I looked at, conversations around water quality, utilizing data aggregation. And what I was really focused on were, what were the perspectives that were being shared by people who were, engaged in those conversations and who were directly impacted by that water ban, and because we sort of have this mentality in agriculture, it's sort of I don't want to say a victim mentality, but we're always looking for, okay, how are we being blamed for something? And so I was really curious as to, what were the connections that were being made by Twitter users who were engaged in this conversation with the cause of the algae bloom that was causing all of this stress. And what I found was that they weren't talking about agriculture. They were talking about where they could get clean water and where, points of access were for them to get, bottled water or water to be able to cook their food and brush their teeth and wash their clothes. And for me, that was a really interesting finding because I think I went into it thinking, oh, well, they're going to talk about agricultural runoff. In the midst of a water crisis, no one cares about agricultural runoff. They care about whether they can drink the water coming out of their taps. And so that really kind of snowballed into other opportunities to study some of these big issues that we're facing our food system and the society and the intersection of our food system and society at large. So I did some work with the Food Waste Collaborative here at Ohio State, looking at food waste and how social media platforms could be utilized to crowdsource ideas for food waste reduction or food waste mitigation. We were looking at the relationships between different social media accounts and the communities that they were sharing information with. So kind of looking at it at more of a 5,000-foot scale, how did that engagement happen? Who were they communicating with? Where were those relationships? And how can we use that as an entry point to have further conversations and substantive conversations about food waste specifically? And more recently, I think I'm in good company here. I do a lot of qualitative research, and a lot of my research on public perceptions of agriculture focus on where people are getting information about where their food comes from and how that influences what they think about the food system and farming. And I always tell people I like to watch television for science, and it's really to help get an understanding of how people's perceptions are being formed. And I don't know about everyone who's on this webinar today or the folks who are on the panel, but most of us are not, when we go to the grocery store, immediately thinking about, that recent USDA report that we read or the CDC advisory, maybe about food safety. Food safety is kind of a different thing. But they're mostly focused on, the cost of the products that they're buying, maybe some other product attribute that they're looking at. But they're not necessarily actively thinking about, I wonder what the farm where this milk came from actually looks like. And so they're getting information from the entertainment media that they consume, the social media that they consume. And so what I've started doing is looking at some of these entertainment media portrayals of farming practices, and kind of using social media data to triangulate what I'm seeing. Because full disclosure, grew up on a farm. And so that really influences my interpretation of social media data, these entertainment media portrayals. All of that is filtered through the lens of someone who grew up on a dairy farm and has a lot of hands-on experience in the industry. So I'm really curious what people who don't have that same lived experience, how they perceive what I'm watching. And so recently what we've started doing is looking at these very specific instances of a dairy farm being used as a setting on a popular television show, or the way that ranch life is depicted in the greater Yellowstone universe and things like that. And then looking at social media conversations around those television shows or those movies or those other social accounts, and getting a sense of, okay, what are the people who don't have my same lived experience taking away from these entertainment media portrayals? So I recently presented a paper at a national conference looking at how, a portrayal of dairy farming in Ireland on an episode of The Real Housewives of Orange County, how that depicted the industry, and then what the fandom of The Real Housewives talked about while that was happening. Because one of the things that I'm really interested in is this concept of social television, and how, second screening and engaging in live chats and live discussions while you're watching something influence what you take away from that viewing experience. And a lot of research has shown that the more engaged you are with this sort of screening or social television behavior, the more engaged you are with the content cognitively, emotionally, psychologically. And so, this is really something that I love using as a way to expand my own interpretation of what I'm watching or what I'm seeing, and to get, a real-time snapshot of folks' opinions, beliefs, attitudes about what they're seeing in real time. And I think that that's something that even in a clinical setting, like a focus group or something along those lines, you can't capture accurately without giving folks the opportunity to participate willingly in this kind of quasi-public forum online, and being willing to share kind of that uncensored view of what they're watching. So that's kind of how I got into social media data, and how I've been using it recently. And I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about what my fellow panelists have been doing and their research, and to take questions.
Thank you all three so much. Thank you, Casey, for like the really, really interesting sort of framework, and like not only the framework, but also like a toolkit for questions we should be asking, which is really helpful. And Erin and Annie, thank you so much for really sharing your work, and also like articulating the actual complexity and time and investment that has to happen to be engaging in this kind of work in an ethical way. And so maybe I'll start with some questions that, I came up with originally. There are already questions that people are posting in the Q&A, so please continue posting those, and we'll get to those shortly. But one of the things that is really interesting, like I love this fruit fly analogy, Casey, and then, but when you hear what Erin and Annie are up to, it sort of brings up this idea that it's not only that social media is this site of, it's an accessible data like platform, right? But it's actually like people are doing weird and interesting things. And the medium is actually sort of creating opportunities for new varieties of public speaking and new varieties of public performance. Um, and that's very exciting to me. Just sort of thinking about the opportunities of what, research related to this kind of data is like possible. And so I just want, before we start thinking about the big ethical challenges, I do want to hear, how is social media not just the fruit fly, right? Like, what are sort of the exciting things that you can do with this data, engaging with this medium, that you wouldn't have been able to do in other venues or with other kinds of more traditional means? So I'll throw it out, maybe start with Erin, and then Casey or Annie, if you want to join in.
Yeah, well, I think one thing I would say to start is, as as an anthropologist, I'm really concerned with, the like, Irving Goffman, this old school sociologist, has this idea that people are performing all the time. Like, there's this performance of everyday life. And so I think that, um, you know, right now we're performing, right? But I think social media platforms, as you're saying, give people like these new opportunities, right? If it's Twitter and you only have 80 characters, that's one kind. We wrote a lot about how like the ability to put a text overlay on a video like allows even more communicative potential, because you're able to, you're able to communicate something kind of entirely different than just the video or just the text. And I think there's a real risk sometimes, when people, I think there's a big risk, right, in taking social media at face value, as if it's like this transparent window into somebody's kind of like soul, right? Or if it's like, you're actually getting access to the inner world through social media. So without like appropriate framing, I think that gets really tricky, right? So yeah, I mean, and I think, TikTok, I think one thing about one thing that we noted about the algorithm, right, is the algorithm, unlike Twitter, unlike Instagram, where, up until a couple of years ago, you were really connected with your own communities, right? It was really kind of, you would connect with friends and friends of friends, and they were community building kinds of apps. TikTok, from what I understand, the algorithm is meant to make videos viral. It's meant to make videos public and to get out there, right? So we know that when somebody is posting something on TikTok, they're not necessarily posting it for a community of people that they are anticipating. They're not necessarily posting it for like a bounded audience that they are envisioning, right? They see a broader public. So I think that's just one example of how the different platforms can shape what the performance is.
Thank you. Annie or Casey, would you like to also talk about the opportunities of this kind of research?
One thing that I think is really interesting about looking at trace data as opposed to talking to people is one that it allows you to answer different kinds of questions. I mean, I think one pitfall is that sometimes people try to answer questions with social media data that probably should be answered by talking to people after those questions start with why. But in addition to like different kinds of questions, some of which being how do people, have to do with the ways that people are interacting online, it also allows for, mitigation of certain types of both selection bias and response bias. So for example, one of the projects that I've done that used public data was I analyzed comments on news articles about the Facebook emotional contagion study, which was a research ethics controversy in 2014, because similar to the study I talked about with Twitter, we were concerned about selection bias of trying to find out what upsets people about a research ethics controversy when people who don't like research probably aren't going to participate in my research study. And so that was the reason that we decided to look at trace data, to look at that question.
Thank you.
So thinking about the type of research that I do, and especially my interest in, this social television phenomenon, very few data collection methods allow you to gather real-time data of the volume that you can gather via something like Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, TikTok, etc. And I think that can be really helpful because, like Casey said, this is an unbounded potential audience or potential pool of participants, right, in your study. And when you are bounded by geography, when you are bounded by other logistical or administrative factors, the findings that you can generate and the conclusions that you can draw from those data sources are very, very limited. And obviously, social media data are not perfect. There are always going to be limitations on who participates and who does not, and who is able to and who is not. But at the very least, you're getting kind of snapshots of what at least the performance of reality looked like in a given moment. And I think that was something that was new to social media data when, in the early 2000s, when these platforms started appearing.
Yeah, and so there's in the queue, I'm just going to jump into some of the Q&A from participants because there's a series of questions related to this sort of performative aspect, and also the fact that what is being posted or what the trace data isn't necessarily, as Erin was saying, like a window into the soul. It's very much mediated. And so, I mean, one question is sort of a specific technical question for Annie related to like, how do you confirm that people are indeed farmers or farm workers, if that is like part of how you're thinking about your target population? But then there's a student in education studies who's researching disinformation and conspiracy theories in social media and is wondering about this performative element, and how do we address that we may be looking at this sort of distorted or exaggerated version of people's views, the way they want other people to like see them, those sorts of questions. So how is that affecting the way you interpret the work, the kinds of questions you can ask, and the sort of ethics behind engaging in this research?
Well, I can first address the conversation or the question about how do you determine whether someone is actually a member of the population that you're trying to study? It kind of depends on the platform, but thinking about, the early work that I did looking at Twitter and agricultural communities, there weren't that many people who were posting with the hashtag AgChat who were not already aware of the hashtag AgChat. It was a very small number of folks. I think the largest conversation that they had on any given Wednesday night probably involved about 30 to 50 people. It's a pretty small community. So unless someone was specifically kind of trolling for that particular hashtag, the chances that someone outside of our field, no pun intended, were participating in that conversation were pretty low. But looking at something like, The Real Housewives, which has thousands of people who are, live tweeting or live, on Reddit in their various fandom communities, that's a lot of self-selection, right? You are identifying yourself as a fan of that program by utilizing the hashtags and engaging in the conversation. So in that mindset, I wasn't looking specifically for just people who are involved in agriculture with The Real Housewives and the other reality television work that I've done. It's more just who's engaging in the conversation and utilizing some of those hashtags and other kind of linguistic tools to tie themselves to that. And so, yeah, it's self-selection. And in terms of, that performative nature of it, one of the things that we talk a lot about as researchers and as scholars when we're getting trained in research methods and research ethics, we learn a lot about the fact that basically any research intervention you do, whether it's observation, whether it's a survey, whether it's a focus group or an interview, there's a level of performance there once people know that they are being observed or their information is being taken down or recorded in some way, shape, or form. And so it's kind of hard to make the argument that social media data is any more or less performative. I mean, we can anecdotally say that it's probably a little bit more just based on what we know about participating in social media. But there are inherent biases and inherent issues with really any data collection method. And so acknowledging that is absolutely super important and something that we should always do. But we also have to make those acknowledgments regardless of how we're collecting our data, unless we're working with, anytime you're working with human subjects, human error, performance, all of those are things at play.
Erin or Casey, would you like to add? Yeah.
Yeah, I can just jump in to say too, I mean, and I think this is kind of picking up on what Annie was saying too. I think there's, you know, studying any kind of communication, right? There's the author has an intention, and then there's the audience on the other end that they intend or that they don't intend, right? And so the reception of what the media is too is, I mean, I think those are actually can be very distinct questions. And I would also say that just to say something is performed doesn't make it any less real, right? So this TikTok phenomenon that we kind of identified, which is really, you know, identifying the psychological trauma of what it means to have to manage a kid's, you know, potentially fatal illness, and not only that, but having to cause them pain while you're doing it. Of course, these were produced videos. I mean, the parents had to set the phone in a certain way to show bruises on kids' arms, and like there was a lot that went into making that production there. But then the production is there, right? So the production can still be analyzed. It's like its own artifact or its own thing to look at. And I think that's the case with, you know, like political extremism, right? That artifact is still there, even if maybe that is an exaggeration or something of people's, like, you know, true feelings or commitments. So.
So maybe I'll jump into another question related to sort of the pervasive nature of the data and tensions related to privacy that have already been sort of talked about. One of the attendees says, you know, when a person creates an account, for any of those platforms, they're agreeing to the data, to the way in which their data can be used, shared, and sold according to the terms. And Casey, as you mentioned, when we ask participants about whether or not they think certain things are permissible, they aren't necessarily tracking what are parts of the terms of the agreement. And so one of the things that really has come up already in this conversation that I think is interesting, we tend to think about the public nature, the pervasiveness of the data as like, oh, people are like publicly sharing. It's already out there, right? But Casey, one thing that you sort of talked about is sort of the ethics of sort of changing the language. And I mean, one of the things that is kind of interesting about a lot of this data and its pervasiveness, it's the accessibility of tracing it back to people, and really being able to re-identify people in a very sort of clear and easy way. And so I'm just wondering what you think researchers should do to really think about the medium and then really protecting people's privacy in the way that you think is appropriate, and what strategies you think you've used or you think that you've seen other people use that are successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I mean, one thing is people don't read terms of service. And even if they did, they wouldn't understand them. I've done multiple studies about terms of service, actually. Some of them have included like, you know, grade level analysis and that sort of thing. Like many terms of service are written at a level where you need a PhD to understand the language in them. I also did a study where we analyzed the data scraping provisions in terms of service, because that's something that comes up in research ethics, is whether it's okay for researchers to collect data when the terms of service says that they can't. And basically the conclusion that we came through from doing that study is that terms of service are completely useless for making any kind of ethical decision, because they don't have anything to do with ethics. And they very rarely mention like research at all. They're not like these terms around the terms around like, oh, you know, if you're agreeing to the terms of service, you're agreeing that your content can be shared, et cetera. Like that's not what they're made for, like external people coming in, and often they very explicitly say that external people can't collect that data. So that's, I mean, I think that's kind of interesting, but also, with respect to privacy and audience and that kind of thing. I think, I think the point that Erin made about TikTok in particular was spot on. I mean, actually, I don't know if you know this, Erin, but there's a non-zero chance I'm in your data set. I'm a type 1 diabetic and I post on TikTok about it. So, but TikTok is inherently an unknown audience. Like when people do tend to post on TikTok knowing that there's a reasonable chance that anything could go viral at any time. That's not as true on platforms like Twitter, where even though you might know intellectually that this is public, you still think that your audience is your 200 Twitter followers and not like the entire audience of Jimmy Kimmel. Uh, um, and so, I have heard like ethicists argue about this, like, is it, is it our responsibility as researchers to sort of deal with people's unreasonable, like arguably unreasonable expectations of privacy? Should we be doing more to educate people? Or, should we be thinking about the norms of the community, even if we think that they're unreasonable, in terms of privacy and this kind of thing? This is why I don't tend to tell people not to use public data in their research. But the kind of thing that you mentioned, ethical fabrication, is a great example of like a mitigation technique. If you're going to write a paper about, people who reveal their HIV status on social media, then maybe like don't lead people back to the original post. And so I think those are the kinds of questions that people should be asking themselves.
Any other follow-ups? Maybe as you think about it. So there's one follow-up that I think is really interesting that just came up in the chat from a researcher that's engaged in political expressions in online media outlets within authoritarian systems. And they have been focusing on the media outlets that offer greater anonymity for user security. And I mean, I think that one of the, interesting things to think about maybe is the current, the pointing attention to certain expressions that even if they're out there, when researchers point attention to it, that might expose them to more risks than just the public speech. And I don't know if, this just seems like a thing in the air that I've been sort of thinking about related to protecting participants more broadly, but I wonder how to think about using media that is actually more respectful of privacy versus other sort of mediums that are potentially less prone to protect sort of posters' rights. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or if you've, I don't know if others have concerns or worries or have actually made those sorts of decisions on the basis of the privacy rights protections of the medium itself.
I would say that if it is a context in which the users very reasonably have a higher expectation of privacy, I would be even more careful about how I'm using that. In particular, not like disseminating the content beyond like the actual content beyond where it is. I mean, this is one of the challenges with data sets. I feel like is that so if you post on Reddit, say, and then a year later you're like, man, I really should not have posted that thing on Am I the Asshole or whatever, right? Like, and you could delete it. But if it's in a data set somewhere that you no longer have control over, then you don't have the ability to delete it or to change your username or that sort of thing. Yeah, I'll give a sort of concrete example. So I was a graduate student at Georgia Tech when Yik Yak was really popular. Do you guys remember Yik Yak? Like the anonymous, geo-fenced, mostly to college campuses, where people were posting things, and it was based in Atlanta. And so we're like, oh my God, Georgia Tech was one of the first places to have it. We're like, this is fascinating. We need to study this. And I, being the buzzkill lawyer in the lab, went and read the terms of service, which like very specifically said, don't scrape this data. And so my advisor was like, well, we know them. He came and gave a talk. We'll just ask for permission. And they said no, do not scrape this data. And then meanwhile, other people are like writing papers with UCAC data and ignoring this. And we're like sitting there like, oh, but I actually think there was a very good reason not to scrape that data, because the users not only had an expectation of complete anonymity, but the content disappeared after like a couple of days or something. So they completely had an expectation that what they posted on that site would not be archived. And so I think that when platforms are taking special measures to protect their users in a certain way, I think that you, as a researcher, you would need a really, really, really good reason to violate that, which sometimes there might be.
So maybe I'll ask Annie, yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna jump in, and
Yeah.
the way that I have always looked at social media data gathering and participating, if you have to assume an identity that is not your own and is not inherent to you're participating in that community, you should have a really, really long, hard think about the research that you are doing. If I have to basically use some level of subterfuge to enter a Facebook group that is heavily moderated and has parameters for joining, I'm probably not going to study that unless I am a member of a community that is relevant to the interests of that group. And I think that that gets to Casey's point. When there's a higher level of expectation of anonymity, of privacy, of the security of the information staying within that community, that's especially when you need to be super careful and cognizant of the ethical considerations that you are taking into account.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, part of this is already sort of percolating in the conversation, but maybe this is a good opportunity to move on to a question about ownership and also like authorization. So, on your view, does any entity or individual own this data? Is it the Yik Yak like creators who like own the data? Is it the individual creators that are posting the data? And it's not a legal question, Casey. It really is like an ethical question. Like, who should we be really thinking about ownership, if ownership is the appropriate way of thinking about these sorts of categories? And even if ownership isn't the way of thinking about these categories, apologies. Is Are reasonable expectations that come out of norms of different mediums another way of thinking about it rather than ownership? So just sort of like the question is like, who are the owners? Is ownership even a useful category when thinking about the ethics of conducting this kind of research? And if not, how should we think about the data and, whose data is it anyway? So maybe, yeah. Who does anyone want to jump in? Otherwise, I'll call on someone.
I mean, my first question whenever I hear like this question is like, what do you mean by ownership? You said it's not a legal question, so I'm going to assume you're not talking about copyright, which is a whole other thing. So then I think that ownership, maybe it means control, which is, maybe going back to that point about like, do you have the ability to delete it as part of control? Do you have the ability to keep other people from doing something with it? I mean, which is kind of what copyright does. Um, you know, Social media platforms make it in their terms of service tend to make it extremely clear that they are not claiming ownership over your content. They mean copyright when they say that, like legal ownership, but they have the right to like display it and, you know, often modify it in these kinds of things. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to like, do you have the ability to control what other people do with this? And the answer for public social media content is probably no. Uh, and then I think that in terms of thinking about this ethically, like it just means that people should be thinking about all of these things and what are, you know, the potential harms and how can we mitigate them. Or you can decide to like always respect someone's control over their own content and only use social media data with consent, which not many people are doing because of the scale, right?
Yeah, I think yeah, I was thinking about like not necessarily ownership, but like who does the data like belong to? And also then the question of like, and also what makes it data, right? Because I think the conversation so far has been that everything that is on social media, every like piece of text, every word, every emoji is data, right? But for for me, for example, like not everything is data already, right? So you know, the disclosure of HIV status might not be data to someone studying like, you know, treatment activism, but statements about like the need for more antiretroviral therapy, like would then belong to like would become data and belong to maybe like the movement or something. So, you know, I don't know if that gets us very far, but I think that, yeah, I think thinking about I mean, this also comes back to what Casey, I think, was saying at the very beginning, right? Like, what kind of communities is this data being produced within, and then who does it belong to, and what are you know, what are we doing with it? I also wanted to kind of jump in here in terms of ownership because, and I don't, and I guess it's a question, but we know we're having a research ethics conversation, and I can't imagine that there are a bunch of people like sitting around at like PepsiCo or whatever thinking like, oh, let's have an ethical conversation about how we get people's data to sell and to sell them things, right? And I could be wrong about that, but yeah, I guess the intention behind trying to get the data and define the data as such is what I wanted to point to.
Yeah, thank you. And Erin, can I just ask like a clarificatory question about the difference between like what is data for you depending on your question? Is the idea that there are certain like HIV disclosure isn't going to count as a piece of data in your data set, even if it's something that is accessible to you through the sort of they've publicly made clear that they are HIV positive, that's not going to be part of your data set. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I guess I think the ethics, yeah, I maybe follow the questions, right? Which is kind of like the intention behind using the data, right? So if you want to understand, if you want to know how many people on Twitter are tweeting or like releasing their HIV status, then I don't know, why do you want to know that? You know, I guess, but like I feel like I mean, and I'm sure there are good reasons to want to know that, and maybe that leads to more community connection or something like that. But yeah, I just think that again, the intention behind trying to get the data is actually what reveals them as data. And at least in my case, as like as an ethnographer going and trying to understand cultural phenomena via social media. So
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I mean, in some ways, it goes to a very normal understanding of how to think about risks of any kind of research, like biomedical research, where it's like you look at the individual intervention, like piecemeal, and determine whether or not do we need to actually engage in this kind of operation, practice, intervention in order to answer the research question. And this sort of highlights, I mean, in some way instantiates Casey's idea that like, in order to think about risks and benefits, we need to like really start thinking about not only who benefits and whether or not the people that are benefiting are potentially part of the community that are taking on these potential risks, but also in a much more piecemeal fashion, like, are these risks justified given the kind of research question that we're interested in? So it's really a helpful distinction. So we only have about 5 minutes left, and one thing that has been brought up is the sort of community versus individual harm. And I kind of would love to hear a little bit more, and also benefit for individuals. And I would love to hear a little bit more from each of you about how we should think about the potential for group harms and benefits when it comes to this research. How have you thought about it in your own research, and how have those questions motivated your own work and practice? Maybe we'll start with Casey, and then Annie and Erin, you could jump in.
So one research ethics controversy from a few years ago was a researcher who collected YouTube videos from people going through gender transition in order to train a facial recognition system to be able to basically tell if someone was on HRT. And a journalist found some of the people who were in these videos and spoke to them, and they didn't know that that they were included in this data set. And they were quite upset about it, in part because the reason that they made these videos in the first place was to like help their community, you know, making themselves quite vulnerable, wanting to help people with their stories. And then they found out, you know, not only was this content being used without their consent, with their faces, but also it was being used to help build a technology that could potentially harm their community. And so they saw it as, you know, not just about individual harm, but about community harm. And the other thing I would add is that there is sometimes a risk in studying an online community in just the potential harm that could come to bringing unwanted attention to it, even if it isn't a like negative community, which is a whole other kind of thing. And then you have to consider researcher safety and that kind of thing. But even just something like there's research that shows that like a huge influx of new users to a subreddit causes a bunch of problems. And so that's when, you know, thinking about community gatekeepers and like giving people a heads up and that kind of thing can be really helpful.
So and Casey, it's funny you bring that up because I joined Blue Sky not too long ago, and there have been people have their starter packs of Blue Sky users, and folks have been talking about, the influx of new followers they get when their account is included in one of those, and they're just like, I hope you're here for the right reasons, etc. So found that kind of an interesting connection there. I think, a lot of my research is not focused on the type of, personal, especially health and psychological and, those types of issues that have a really profound opportunity to harm either an individual or community. And I think part of that is my own risk aversion to, you know, putting others in the position of potentially being doxxed, being identified, having other sensitive information shared publicly. And so, a lot of my research is focuses on, again, that like public perception aggregate level type of finding. But it is something that I definitely consider when I start thinking about what type of research do I want to do? Do I need access to a particular online community to do that? And if so, I definitely weigh the benefits and the drawbacks potentially for that community. And, I think I've moved away a little bit from doing research on the data that community members or individual users are producing and utilizing social media more as a means to connect with those communities, to be able to like find alternative ways to get their insights or to work with them on research in a way that allows them to opt in, right? So joining a community to share a link to a survey that people could potentially engage with, where they are sharing information, maybe related to the norms, the behaviors, the goings on of the community, but they have an option to opt in or opt out. And that has been something that I've definitely been moving toward, especially with now additional limitations on the types of data we can access and the different platforms and the way they make information accessible. And so I've been thinking about it a little bit more as an entry point to a community versus the source of my data about that community, if that makes sense.
Erin, do you want to sort of share maybe any final sort of thoughts about either this question about, thinking about, you are in particular working with a very specific subset of a community. So how are you thinking about the potential benefits and harms related to the community rather than individuals?
Yeah, I just think these are all such great points, and I think the way that I think about, so one thing I would say is that I don't think that anthropological literature is maybe driving tons of people to social media. So I think that's actually, I kind of think about the way that for my impact in that way. Like I'm not totally sure that I would send a bunch of followers anywhere, that'd be great if I did. But I think that the way that Casey and Annie described how they're considering what they're, like these different ways to weigh the ethics. I can identify with that. And again, I think it would go back for me to the question, and ethnographers are like constantly reevaluating our questions. I think both for like, are we with the data that we have, like, and then once we get the data, okay, is this question still valid? And then I think that involves like thinking through the ethics, like at every step. So whether or not it's using social media as an entry point to a community, right, to reach out to an activist and say, I found you on social media, can we talk? I think that's its own kind of thing. Am I personally part of this community? Is that how I'm getting the access? But for me, it would be like a continually revisiting. It's not like that. And I think probably we all agree, right? The ethics don't get decided at the front end and then you go forward. You have to kind of constantly think about it at every step. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. No, one thing that is, I think, really interesting, and, in the elephant in the room, and Casey mentioned this sort of in the beginning, but a lot of this research isn't necessarily even considered human subjects research, depending on the way in which you're engaging with this data. And one of the things that really has come up this whole conversation is the ethical considerations that come in at every stage of the process. And in some ways, you're all lucky because there isn't like the IRB like approval that like has that sort of stamp or landmark or, door that is sort of okay, now the ethics has been approved. So it seems like it has made ethical deliberation really a part of your all's practice. So thank you so much for sharing that this past hour and 15 minutes. And hopefully for the participants, you can join in other Love Data Week activities that are going on this week. And the March, our next panel is going to be on the ethics of psychedelic research. So hopefully you can join us for that. All right. Bye-bye.